So there's a couple different dimensions to understanding the role that the media plays, both in terms of how people understand climate change and also the polarization on the issue. One of the things that remains one of the common explanations about why we have inaction on climate change is that the mainstream media continues to engage in false balance about the fundamentals of climate science. If you read the liberal or scientific blogosphere, if you go to a scientific meeting or a meeting of environmentalists, you'll often hear people complain about the problem of false balance. In part, I think this explanation, is no longer true. And that relying on this explanation shields us from some of the deeper considerations about policy and our own communication strategies. What we know from research over time is that, yes, false balance among the mainstream news outlets remained a problem in the early 2000s through the late 1990s. But by the best research we have available to us, by 2007, at the trend-setting national news outlets, on the fundamental questions of is climate change real, is it human-caused, false balance had virtually disappeared from these trend-setting news outlets. In recent research that I released, I updated that for 2009 and 2010, and I found that that pattern remained. It's certainly the case that false balance and false information remains at outlets like political talk radio. You can certainly, the most readily available source of false information about climate change and false balance that you can find, dismissive coverage, is at Fox News or in the conservative blogosphere. But what we know from several decades also of research in political communication is that the people who use this media and who also are most likely to accept these claims are those people with a strong conservative identity and who are already doubtful about climate change. So those are sort of the two central dimensions of the media that we continue to debate and to think about. Is mainstream media engaging in false balance, and is Fox News and conservative media have a wider input on public opinion? The answer to both questions is that it is in the negative. The mainstream media have moved beyond a pattern of false balance. In fact, the mainstream media overwhelmingly portrays the consensus views on the fundamentals of climate science. And for Fox News and conservative media, they have an important influence on a conservative audience, a reinforcing influence, but their influence relative to the wider public remains limited. Like the belief that false balance in mainstream media continues to inhibit action on climate change, there's also the belief that one of the reasons why we're not able to pass cap and trade and not able to have major political action on climate change is that environmentalists and other groups remain massively outspent on the issue. But the reality is that instead of a traditional David versus Goliath explanation on the role of money and spending, what you really see on climate change now is two Goliaths going at each other. In my recent research, I looked at 45 national environmental groups who have worked on climate change historically and that worked in support of cap and trade for the most part. And then I also looked at 42 conservative think tanks, advocacy groups, and industry associations who were their long-standing opponents, right? So the two areas of the not-for-profit advocacy community relative to climate change: what is their total overall organizational resources? How much are they spending on their programs? And how much can be estimated that they can spend, that they spent while cap and trade was being debated on climate change and energy-related activities? And what I find is that the environmental groups in 2009, at the height of the economic recession, brought in $1.7 billion in revenue, spent about $1.4 billion on all program activities, and from what can be estimated, about $390 million on climate and energy. They're long-standing opponents among conservative think tanks, advocacy groups, and industry associations. They brought in about $900 million in revenue, spent about $800 million on all program activities, and about $250 million on climate and energy-related activities. So the environmental movement among advocacy coalitions in Washington, D.C. and nationally, few, if any, other social movements have as much resources and spend as much money as the environmental movement. There's an argument to be made that the effort to pass cap and trade was the best financed political cause in American history. There's limits to how environmental groups can spend their money. But to say that environmental groups are massively underfunded or they face a spending disadvantage against their long-standing opponents among conservative think tanks, industry associations, and advocacy groups, that's a false argument.